Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at an updated version of the Alliance Conquest tier list that I made previously. It's been a while now since we've gotten a full update, so I'm taking that opportunity to update the list before the next big update drops. If you don't remember from the previous tier list video, the categories for the characters are meta, which is further broken down into 3 subcategories, being top meta, upper meta, and lower meta. Then you have the A tier class, the B tier class, the C tier class, and characters that are filler and pretty much are just used to fill up the spots necessary in order to perform an attack in Alliance Conquest. The top meta is made up of the best characters for the mode and are usually characters that can take out any other character in the game, and opponents usually struggle to take out these opponents. So I usually call these characters walls, especially if you put multiples of those same characters on the same team, effectively preventing your opponent from taking out a particular zone. After that, you have the upper meta, or what I call solos, which are characters that can basically solo most other teams, but aren't necessarily too difficult to be taken out themselves. Following that, you have the lower meta, which I also call busters, and these are characters that, similarly to solo characters, can potentially take out very strong teams, but usually require assistance, that being 1 or 2 other supports to do so. After that, you have characters that fall in the A tier, which are borderline meta and usually are missing some small detail that prevents them from being in the meta, which is stuff like reflect, revive, immortality, iframe ignore, or even a bunch of iframes themselves. The main distinction here is that characters that fall into the meta are ones that you typically would want to revive in between phases, i.e. the standby phase in Alliance Conquest, and those that aren't in the meta are typically ones that you wouldn't really consider reviving. B tier characters are even further down, missing even more tools and possibly even uniforms or upgrades in order to be able to consistently compete with the previous characters or character tiers. And then finally, the C tier and the tier after that are mostly fillers for the most part, but the C tier can have some use, but usually struggle because they are missing an upgrade, whereas the filler tier is basically missing everything, including a functional uniform. Moving on to the actual changes for the tier list, you can see in bold that those are the characters from the previous updates that got changes or that moved around in the list. Hela is the first character that I changed. She was previously in the top of the upper meta category, and I recently moved her into the top meta category because with a maxed out artifact, if you're lucky enough to get one, she definitely belongs at that list with the other characters because she can potentially one-shot characters with her counter skill, and she is very difficult to take down with that 7 seconds of immortality. Even if you don't have the maxed out artifact, she's still a pretty big pain to deal with because of her constant iframe and healing, and she constantly also applies CC effects that weakens the opponent, making it even tougher for them to take her out. Even though she's frequently used for her support capabilities, I noticed that she's often the last one left alive on a team, which is one of the criteria for putting a character in the top meta or the walls category. Speaking of last one left alive, I've noticed that Emma Frost is frequently the last character left on a team, which is one of the reasons why I preemptively put her in the top meta category. Although she might be somewhat easy to counter with speed types, she is a very strong character, especially when her third skill is used and she has that 85% mitigation up. You don't necessarily need her artifact for her to function, but if you want to get the most value from her and for her performance to be at the highest level or the top meta, you definitely need the artifact for that, especially because the reflect effect is so effective for her. She can frequently one-shot characters with her counter skill and that reflect skill. She constantly stays in her iframe skills, and with a lot of strong combats being at the top of the current meta, she acts as a potential counter towards them. If you want to get a better idea of why I put her in this category, I actually have some Alliance Conquest clips at the end of this tier list part, so make sure to check that out in order to see how you can team her and potential counters that you can use versus her. Spider-Man is the third character that I placed in the top meta tier because of his dominance in being able to take out pretty much any character, including ones that he has a type disadvantage versus. Although that does obviously depend on the build that you're using and the team that you use him with, as well as some potential luck. Even though he can be hard countered with a combat type relatively easily because of so many strong combat types, he's definitely a pain to deal with because he can constantly iframe, lock down your opponent, and heal up at the same time. I did put him in third though because Emma Frost is a little bit tougher to deal with that 85% mitigation, especially if you have her with a support like Colossus or have an additional effect like the steal effect from CTP Authority, making her take basically no damage at all. And then you also have Hela, which is kind of a bigger pain to take out as well, especially if the opponent has an artifact that gives her that 7 seconds of immortality. This is why I have the characters in the order that you see, Hela being at the top, being able to survive the longest, Emma Frost afterwards, and then Spider-Man underneath those two. Spider-Man is also a very strong counter versus villains like Doom and Hela, as well as Emma being a blast type, and because the blast types are kind of lacking and are probably going to be making a comeback, he definitely deserves to be in that top spot. Besides those three characters, there isn't as much to say about the other character tier shifts. Mr. Sinister is one of the characters that got a pretty big improvement, but didn't end up making it in the top meta category or the walls category because his artifact, although gives him immortality and makes him a problem with that awakening skill kind of ticking down and being used when the 30 seconds are up, he doesn't have things that make him stronger like an iframe ignore or a really good AI rotation where he would make the most use of his damage buffs and other things in his kit. That said, if you're able to get a good level artifact for him, he can be a headache, especially if you team him with some strong supports, say like Black Dwarf Lead, that gives him that physical immunity, and because he has self-debuff removal or kind of self-cleanse, you don't really have to worry too much about giving him a debuff remove lead. Besides that, he frequently rotates between his third and his fourth skill, which are both iframe skills, keeping him from taking too much damage. Colossus is one tier further down, since his uniform didn't really help him too much. It only basically made him a niche counter versus other physical types. Although you don't really need his artifact, I did include that artifact icon there because if you want to make the most out of him, you kind of need that for him to survive long enough to either go into his awakening or reflect enough damage for speed types, I guess, that iframe a lot and can avoid the reflect damage that way. I put Kingpin one tier lower since although he's actually pretty good with his burst damage, considering that he usually opens with his 5th skill and it's his highest damage skill in his kit and has that 50% penetration to all sources on it. So although that's good, he doesn't really have too much in his kit to keep him alive long enough in order to continue fighting, especially if the opponent is able to survive that initial burst damage. You might be surprised to see that Black Cat, even with no Awakening or T3, is actually in the borderline tier, but I found that her kit is actually really good because of all the CC effects and because her own passive buffs up the duration for those CC effects. So if you have something like an Invincible on her instead of an Insight, the longer that she stays alive, the more that she kind of bypasses that debuff lead for the opponent and is able to basically fully lock down the opponent and beat them that way. If she had a T3 or Awakening skill to assist to keep her alive longer, I definitely think that she would belong in the meta tier, especially because her passive is able to boost up your own team's CC effects as well, not only herself, which means that you can turn other characters on that team into lockdown characters too. And finally, I put Psylocke in this tier as well because she doesn't really have the tools to compete with the meta tier, but she can potentially one-shot characters because of her high damage, and because she has guard break immunity built into her kit, she has the flexibility of allowing you to build in several different ways, meaning that you can build her with something like a Transcendence if you want to try to keep her alive longer, or you can build her with a Judgment and pair her with a good team like Wong or Colossus lead or something in order to better counter those combat types while trying to extend her survivability. So here are the clips for Emma Frost in Alliance Conquest, like I mentioned before. The first test is a straightforward one. I'm trying to see if she can solo a Hulk and Silver Surfer set, and she obviously has the damage to take out Hulk because of the type advantage, but because of her iframes, she also can bypass the reflect from Silver Surfer. The second test is to see if she can take out a stronger combat with 2 supports and my damage immunity. Because of her all mental resist down, she is able to win this set. In this next test, I took it one step further, with Gilgamesh having Colossus support, making him even tankier, and the debuff from Cersei. On top of that, Cersei also has her Nuke Awakening skill that can basically one-shot characters, but because of the mitigation and the CTP of authority that I'm using on Emma, I'm able to survive that and win this fight. Since she can obviously beat combat types fairly easily, regardless of the amount of supports that they have, the next test that I do is to see how well she does versus other meta team sets like Dormammu and Mephisto. As you can see, even though the characters have 2 lives and Dormammu has Reflect, as well as there being a support on the team, I'm still able to win this fight. The last teams that I took her up against was versus a Sentry with a Blue Marvel support and a Shang-Chi for the Reflex, but as you can see, she usually opens up with her 3rd and then quickly follows up with either the 4th or 5th, which easily takes out the opponent team. Here you can see Sentry using his 5th skill, and if you pay close enough attention, you'll see that I'm only taking 2 damage and about 1,000 to 2,000 instinct damage. The reason for that is because my 3rd skill is up, which gives me that 85% mitigation, and because I have the steal effect on my authority, it makes it so that I effectively go over 100% and take only 2 damage for that duration. This is one reason why I myself used a CTP of authority and recommended it over regen, since you can go through phases of basically being immortal for a 5-second duration. Also, as you can see in the second fight, and in certain instances if you get lucky, she can potentially solo a Doom Wolverine set, which is really impressive. Now, if you're wondering how to counter Emma, one of the obvious go-tos is to use Spider-Man. Since he has that type advantage, he iframes through most of her damage, avoiding her reflect, if the opponent has the artifact, of course. And because his passive has that damage mitigation ignore, you can basically cut off a portion of that high 85% damage mitigation that Emma has, and be able to go through and deal damage to her. As you can see in these clips, usually running Emma with Doom or possibly with Doom and Hela is not really the best idea, since Spider-Man himself can pretty much solo every single one of the characters on the opponent team. This is additionally why the character is in the top meta, because he has a lot of passive and abilities or tools in his kit that allow him to hard counter villain types as well as blast types. You see that I use the same teams to counter these sets, and that is typically with Silver Surfer in the lead and Colossus support. I use Colossus to make Spider-Man a little bit tankier or tougher to deal with, as well as making Silver Surfer more of a reflect node versus the opponent, meaning that if they try to burst Spider-Man, they will take a lot of that damage back. Now, although Emma is basically a hard counter to combat types, she does struggle a little bit versus Wolverine because his 5th skill has the capability of removing active buffs from the target, and because he opens with his 5th skill, he can strip that away from Emma, essentially making her die almost instantly from all the damage that she takes afterwards. You can see exactly what I mean in this super slowed down clip. As soon as the fight starts, Emma uses her 3rd skill to get that mitigation buff, which looks like a red square with an arm flexing and has the 10 seconds on it. As soon as it appears, right before it even gets down to the 7-second mark, you'll see that the buff gets removed because Wolverine is going all over the map using his 5th skill and removing the buff from her. And even though Wolverine does end up dying, Him removing the mitigation buff from her allows her to die from the lingering effects that Doom has afterwards. So for this reason, I wouldn't recommend using Emma solely to take out this set, but instead using a strong leadership and a support to assist her in doing so. You can see that I used the same team composition as I did when I subbed in Spider-Man because it worked so effectively. But you can use other strong leaderships like Sentry for example, or possibly even Molecule Man and another strong damage or reflect third character if the opponent has a support that can be cancelled by Molecule Man himself. That effectively wraps up this video. That was the updated tier list, and you can obviously see why I put Hela, Emma Frost, and Spider-Man at the top with the other characters kind of scattered down lower in the tier list. The next update looks like it's going to be themed around the Guardians of the Galaxy with a little bit of a sneak peek, it looked like, for Thanos possibly getting a new uniform and artifact, which means it's going to be interesting to see where these characters shift in the current meta, since the Guardians of the Galaxy have been very bad, I would say, in PvP and PvE. Now, before I end the video, I did also mention that I was going to do a crystal coupon giveaway, since I received those with the Star Agent kind of program that I'm part of. So if you want to be eligible for that, make sure to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with your contact ID or tag for me to give you the actual coupon code on that platform, whether it be Line, Discord, or whatever have you. Just keep in mind though that if you want the coupon code through your email, you need to leave your address as well as the type of email that you are using, whether it be Yahoo, Gmail, Hotmail, or whatever else you have. Just make sure to include that in the comment. Anyways, that does it for this one. Share the video if you think other people will like it, or if you have any questions regarding the tier list, then make sure to ask that in the comments as well. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.